Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
Bryan Steil of Janesville is a Republican running in the 1st Congressional District. Bryan, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you very much for having me.
How did your life and goals change when Speaker Ryan announced that he would not seek another term?
I wouldn't have known I'd be sitting here with you about 3 months ago. So for the last 9 years, I've worked in Wisconsin in manufacturing companies. So I worked for a company called Charter NEX, it's a big plastics manufacturing company. And previously I was at Regal Beloit Corporation, a large industrial manufacturing company. I worked for my hometown in Janesville. And so every day you kind of go in and you're solving problems, working on products. How do you bring products in the door, manufacturing it out of the door? How do you produce a high quality product for customers? And then Paul Ryan, as you noted, announced he wasn't going to seek re-election and started to receive calls of support, encouraging me to run. Looked and analyzed the race and made a decision April 22nd that I'd enter the race. And ever since, we've been kind of building up the momentum and the contacts and the energy needed to be successful in this race. And so it's been a ton of fun, though. You look at, you turn on your cable TV, you might think everybody's kind of fighting with each other. You walk out and you talk to people in Wisconsin, southeast of Wisconsin. People are really overwhelmingly friendly. They're overwhelmingly optimistic about the economy, the direction of our country, that there's going to be a better future for their children than for themselves. And that's a big change over the last 10 years, if you think about where we were 10 years ago. And so it's been a really positive experience being out, talking to voters, getting to know what their issues are, and sharing with the voters what my view and my values are for our nation, our state.
What are they identifying as you meet them as their top issue, Bryan?
The top issues that I hear again and again is pocketbook issues. So there's a real economic wave going on right now. And as I look at that, it's how do individuals kind of surf this economic wave rather than be driftwood and have the economic wave pass under them. And so there's a lot of workforce job training issues. You speak to employees, they want to be able to continue to see and begin to see wage growth is the next step of this economic wave so they can take advantage of it. You talk to employers about their need to be able to find high quality workers for the jobs of the future. And so I think my background in manufacturing pairs really well with that. And my work on the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents is really focused on how do we take students and prepare them for the jobs of the future. And so to me, that's really the core issues that I'm hearing from voters day in and day out on the trail. And it's terrific to have those conversations.
Did the tax reform package help the 1st District in terms of its business and the creation of jobs like you just mentioned?
I think so.
You would have voted for it?
I'm a supporter
Excuse me for interrupting.
I'm a supporter of the tax reform package that went through. I think the more we leave money in the pockets of individuals rather than in Washington, D.C. coffers, the more power we give to the individual, the more power we take away from Washington, the better off we are. And I think we begin to see some of these reforms beginning to work. If you come to southeast Wisconsin, jobs and businesses all across the state have help wanted signs. That would not have been the case 8 to 10 years ago. And so these reforms, these conservative ideas that are out there that we're beginning to see the reforms of, I think are having real impacts on people's lives. People are beginning to see those who were struggling and searching for jobs but a handful of years ago are beginning to see opportunities. And I think there's a real optimism out there with people, but there's progress yet to go. And in particular, we need to now take these reforms and move to the next step, which is to see this wage growth begin to occur so people can get higher paying, family supporting jobs.
What about the criticism that the tax reform package drove up our federal deficit, which now stands at $21 trillion with a T?
So as I look at that, Washington has a spending problem. So Washington doesn't have a taxing problem. And so to grow the economy in a manner that allows people to have jobs that are high paying, family supporting jobs, we need to bring the tax rate back into line so that we can have the economic growth that will ultimately grow the economy to allow us that kind of a down payment. And then we need to bring spending under control. So there's two pieces to that. So the tax reform package I'm supportive of, but then we need to get our spending back under control.
And what areas need to be cut to bring down that deficit, Bryan?
Sure. Well, I think it's there's a number of areas across the board. So let me give you some examples on that in particular, right? So the spending structure right now in Washington encourages people to spend. And so what we need to do is structural reforms that encourages a debate to identify priorities, to be able to fund those priorities, and then to identify areas that are not priorities and not have to fund those priorities. So what does that mean maybe in concrete terms? So if you look at Wisconsin budgets every 2 years. And so sure, there's sometimes fights, sometimes there's some delays on when the budget gets completed, but ultimately it gets done. And then there's 23 months before that fight comes back to the table so that in the state, we focus on other areas other than spending people's money. In contrast, Washington spends every year. Often that fight drifts on months after the budgets are due, and then we begin the process right again. And so Washington gets caught up in this nonstop spending crisis factory. And so what happens is instead of making tough decisions as to what are the priorities of the voters, what are the priorities of people in our home community, we spend on everything. And so we need to go in and address the structural problem that is allowing the federal government to make poor choices and to spend money. Sometimes I compare it, it's as if you take a handful of kids and sit them in a candy store and encourage them to have one piece of candy. You're far better off if you want them to have one piece of candy. Take them to a playground, hand them one piece of candy. Which is more likely for that child to behave? So in Washington, there's some structural reforms that we can put in place to force the tough decision. That's not Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal. That's just good process, good governance. And that's the kind of mindset, private sector background that I'd like to take to Washington.
When Ron Johnson went to Washington, he said, I've got two issues, healthcare and driving down the deficit. Paul Ryan went to Washington to work on the deficit, and it's just soared. How can you actually be a force to address and control the deficit, given the fact that Senator Johnson and Speaker Ryan, by their own admission, have not had any luck?
So I agree it's a challenging problem. And so I again, though, think that there's a lot of structural change that allows people to make poor choices. And so often people go in with good intentions and end up with bad results. But let me give you another example. So we discussed the 2-year budget. Let's look at another example where you can make a change. So in Wisconsin, if you miss the budget deadline, spending remains flat from the year before.
Yes.
And so Washington, in the same scenario, the alternative is the government shuts down. That's a bad decision. And so the threat of the government shutdown then is used to leverage where it encourages both sides to spend. So if person A wants to fund project A, person B wants to fund project B, instead of having a thoughtful conversation as to what's the priority, should we fund A or should we fund B, or being the pejorative word, instead it's a decision of let's fund A and B and avoid the government shutdown. So if you change, there's a 1974 Budget Control Act that could easily be amended and would just alter the default rule. So it's just a default change that changes the structure. So instead of the default being a government shutdown, the default would be 0% spending increases. You would force a difficult conversation, but the right conversation to identify what the priorities are, fund the priority, and not fund the item that's not the priority. And so I think a lot of the problems that we see in Washington are structural, but the good news of it being structural is there are actually mechanisms to change that. And so my background, 15 years ago, I worked for Paul Ryan as an economist and budget analyst for about 1 year out of school after I got a business degree in undergrad. And then I came back home. And you start to, I think, as I look, I combine that private sector experience and some of that public policy background, I look at that and say, there's an opportunity to go in and make a structural change. And so in the manufacturing environment, if you're producing a bad product, you go back and you look at the process, and you'd say, the process is broken. How do we improve the process? I look at Washington with that same private sector background experience, and I say, well, they're producing a bad product. They're not producing a product that serves the interests of the voters. And so then I say, the process is broken. How do you address the process? And so I think as I've had these conversations with individuals, I don't get a pushback. I don't think this is Democrat or Republican, liberal, conservative. Some of these are just good reforms that'll force a decision to be made rather than kicking the can down the road. And Washington has a history of kicking the can down the road.
Some say, let's have a balanced budget federal constitutional amendment, the club that would force spending and revenues to come into line. Is that something you could support?
So I want to be very specific on that. And so the risk of that is that it would result in increased taxes. Because again, Washington has a spending problem. They don't have a taxing problem. And so the real key would be to get that wording correct, where the end result of such a proposal would not be an increase in taxes to pay for the spending. It would be to bring the spending down to an appropriate level of taxation. And so I struggle with that a little bit. I want to see the wording to be exact because there's some real nuance there, and there's a real risk that forcing that resolution would result in higher taxes rather than a reduction in spending. And so I look at it as a process standpoint is process changes are more likely than anything to bring spending down but not result in unnecessary tax increases.
Let's talk about the drivers on that debt. The latest projection is Social Security is technically bankrupt by 2034. How would you save it?
So I don't think there's one easy magic wand approach, right? And so as I look at Social Security, there's a handful of approaches that need to be addressed. One is individuals that are at the age of retirement or approaching the age of retirement need to be protected. No changes for those groups. For groups that are farther off, my generation, I'm 37 years old, folks that are long ways away from retirement, we need to look at reforms that will make sure that Social Security is there for generations to come. I think any changes are going to be a bipartisan approach. I don't think there's going to be a partisan approach to making those long-term reforms. And some of that is addressing, so you have the disability side and then the retirement side of Social Security. And there's opportunities for certain reforms to occur, in particular on the disability side, where we guarantee that people who are having disabilities have an ability to be protected, but also reforms that don't encourage anyone to inappropriately use disability insurance as a mechanism of pulling in funds inappropriately for the government. And so I think that's one of the key reforms. And some of that is that side has been borrowing from the other side of the ledger. And so some of those need to be looked at, but I think there's a bipartisan approach to pulling those reforms in to be able to shore up Social Security.
Let's get into health care this way. Let's back into it with the projection that Medicare is going to exhaust its reserves by 2026. So my larger question on health care, are you still a member of your party that wants to repeal and replace the ACA?
I would if I thought it was going to pass. I don't think there's that appetite right now.
172 times it hasn't.
Yeah, so I'm with you, right? There's a little bit of realism there.
So what are the next steps?
So what are the next steps? Exactly the right question to be asking. So the goal, healthcare costs are too high, and families are struggling under the healthcare cost structure that we have. And so what we need to do is put a patient-centered, doctor-centered approach so that individuals can make the choices that are right for them. And so give you an example of how do you drive costs down and quality up. And let me give you an example of that. So HSAs are a really key idea as to how you drive cost down and quality up. So let me give you a personal example. When I went to graduate school, I had to pay for my own insurance. And so I went out on the marketplace and purchased a Blue Cross, Blue Shield, high deductible plan that I paid for with my own money. It was a $5,000 high deductible. It was a lot of money. And so I was a healthy young guy. I had a dentist I used my entire life. It was under my parents' insurance when I was a kid. They probably paid the deductible, so I couldn't tell you what it was. And I know I couldn't tell you what the total program cost because the insurance company covered it. And so then I was on this high deductible plan. So for the first time ever, I called my dentist that I had used my entire life and said, how much will it cost for me to get my teeth cleaned and an x-ray? He said, I can't tell you. I said, I'm not sure I follow you. I said, I know exactly what I want. It's the same I got last year. I want my teeth cleaned. I want an x-ray. He said, I can't tell you the price. This is a handful of years. And I said, well, this doesn't make any sense. I would never get on a plane and fly to Denver and get off and then ask the airline, well, thanks for the ride. How much do I owe you? Absolutely the opposite. You'd be price sensitive as to what your ticket costs. And so I went around and I shopped. I called a number of dentists and found a dentist that gave me, and it was a balance. It was not the lowest price dentist, right? It was a balance of quality and price. And so in doing that, you're empowering the consumer. You're giving the dentist or the doctor the ability to make decisions that are right for you. And ultimately, you're going to drive costs down and quality up. But I want to be clear, that's not a solution for everything. That's a solution for certain items. So if you get in a car accident, you have a heart attack, you need immediate coverage. You're not going to make a cost-sensitive, thoughtful analysis approach. Let's not take that too far. But there are areas where I think there's logical agreement where we can get consumers controlling their dollars, making decisions that are right for them, that will have a serious impact on driving costs down and quality up.
Right. The Trump administration sent Congress a budget that for military Pentagon spending would dramatically increase it to, I think, more than $700 billion a year. Would you vote for that increase?
Look, the world's a really dangerous place. And so I think we need a strong military that's properly funded so you can negotiate from a position of strength. So there's a handful of areas around the globe, North Korea, Iran, Russia, that need to be negotiated from a position of strength. And so there's been a period of time where our military was hollowed out. The number of deaths that were occurring in training was greater than the number of deaths that were occurring in combat. And so the investment to go back into the military, to strengthen our armed forces, so that ultimately we can have a safer, more peaceful world. And so the negotiation, though, has to occur from a position of strength. And it's a sad reality in this world, but our military needs to be strong, properly funded, so that we can maintain a peaceful world order. And you do that, in my view, from negotiating with some of these bad third-party actors from a position of strength.
You mentioned Russia. What was your reaction when President Trump at Helsinki this week, it's been a very active news week, said he believed President Putin that they didn't try to interfere with the 2016 election?
Sure. So Russia's not our ally. And so Russia has been working to destabilize the global order and in particular democracies for a number of years. They've destabilized Ukraine with their intervention in Crimea. They destabilized Georgia. They've destabilized Syria. And they're doing that to serve their own self-interests. And so Russia needs to be met with strength. And until Russia changes its behavior, we need to continually challenge Russia's aggression to protect democracies around the globe.
Do you think Russia extensively tried to interfere with the presidential election?
I mean, I look at the intelligence community, and I have nothing to not believe the intelligence community with. I'm not privy to intelligence briefings that aren't available to the mass media because I'm not in elected office. But from what I understand from those intelligence briefings, absolutely, it looks pretty clear, as I understand it, that Russia meddled in the election, and any country that meddles in the democratic process of the United States, there needs to be consequences for those countries.
The international debate over tariffs. I think the president said yesterday he would be open to putting tariffs on all $500 billion worth of goods that make up our imbalance in trade with China. Is he on the right path in tariffs?
So trade's important for the state of Wisconsin. We trade agricultural products, we trade manufactured products, and when given the opportunity to trade freely and fairly, Wisconsin companies and Wisconsin farmers will win again and again. But what that needs to be is free, fair, reciprocal trade. And so there's instances where our allies, and in particular China, don't allow a fair trading ground for us to trade our goods. And so I'll give you an example. Canada has a convoluted milk pricing system. Yep. Wisconsin dairy farmers deserve the right to be able to trade, export our dairy products to Canada at a free and fair and reciprocal trade level. And if given that opportunity, Wisconsin farmers will win the day every day. And so I understand what the president's doing is he's trying to bring these people back to the table and to find a way to ultimately get to free, fair, reciprocal trade. Tariffs, I don't think are the right path. I think tariffs are a tax and are unstable for the business and farming community in our state. But ultimately, I understand the objectives of the president, just disagree with the tactics.
So should the president dial back some of the tariffs that he's already announced and announce that he won't put tariffs on $500 billion worth of goods, the imbalance with our trade with China, excuse me?
Well, I'm optimistic that we're going to get to a spot where these countries come back to the table and negotiate to allow America companies and Wisconsin farmers and Wisconsin job-produced products to be able to be traded freely and fairly around the globe. And so I'm tracking that. But again, I think there's an opportunity to get these countries to come back to the table and to find opportunities such that we can export our goods in a free, fair, reciprocal way. And if given that opportunity, our workforce is going to win the day.
With the context of mass shootings and school shootings, do we need to change national gun laws?
So as you look at what's going on in some of our schools and around our communities, we have a real serious problem. So how do you address that? And so to me, first and foremost is we need to enforce the gun laws that are on the books right now. So there's been instances where those have not been fully enforced. And so I think we need to put resources in place to fully enforce the gun laws on the books that will have a really significant impact. So there's criminals that have weapons that they should not legally have. Those laws need to be enforced. There's other individuals with mental health problems that have secured weapons. We need to have a real comprehensive look as to where we can strengthen the enforcement of the gun laws that are on the books.
If you buy a gun at a private gun show, should it be subject to a background check?
I mean, as I look at the gun laws as they exist, what we have is a problem of enforcement of the gun laws that are on the books. Before we even look to solutions down the road, what we need to do is step one is enforce the gun laws that are on the books today.
The immigration issue, where should it go from here?
So the immigration system across the board is broken. Nobody would design a system that we have today if they tried. And so Democrats, Republicans alike have failed us. And so how do we get immigration reform on the books? And so I look at it and it starts with step one, we need to secure the border. And so
With a wall.
Well, I think a wall is a piece of it, but I think there's a broader approach that needs to be taken as well. And there's multiple reasons you need to do that. If you talk, I was speaking yesterday with the law enforcement community in Kenosha, and we were talking about where is the heroin that's coming into this community coming from. It's traversing the border from Mexico to the United States. And so securing the border is a multifaceted reason as to why you need to do that. But in part of that is from an immigration standpoint, we need to know who's in the United States and who's not. That's a reasonable approach. And then as you get that in place, that prevents you from having the same problem happening again. Then you need comprehensive immigration reform to deal with the large number of people that are here in the United States.
Should that include a path to A, citizenship, or a legal status?
So as I look at some of those groups, yeah, absolutely. There needs to be a path to legal status, not amnesty, but there needs to be a path to legal status for individuals that are here. In particular, the DACA group would be an example of that, right? There's individuals that came here through no fault of their own.
Legal status and not full citizenship.
Legal status.
Okay, and what steps should they have to undertake? What criteria to get that legal status?
Well, I think that's going to be part of a broader conversation to get to a comprehensive immigration reform. And so as I look at that, it would be a dialogue that's going to require a bipartisan approach. And so it's going to be to sit down, and there's going to be different requirements for different groups. I mean, you take some individuals are here for different reasons. So you take children who came here in DACA, who came here through no fault of their own, effectively not born here, but raised in the United States of America. That group might have different requirements than another group. And so inside of this, there's not a cookie cutter approach. I think sometimes we look to Washington to create cookie cutter approaches, and that's often where things fail. And so I think there's going to be a broad bipartisan approach to comprehensive immigration reform to address each of these distinct groups distinctly.
Should someone who crosses the border illegally be immediately deported without due process?
I think you're entitled to a due process. I think there's more nuance into that question than maybe it sounds at the surface, right? So there's individuals that arrive at border checkpoints who request amnesty.
Yes.
There's an entire process that's available to those individuals. That's a different process than crossing illegally and then claiming amnesty after the fact. And so as you look into those different buckets, there's different groups that are going to have a different process. And so not all individuals here who, your words, are here illegally, right, are here for the same reasons. There's not all those individuals that are here under the same purpose, under the same mechanisms. And some of those approaches will be different for some of those different people.
Polls show that the potential investment of Foxconn and the tax breaks from state and local government divide Wisconsin residents. Do you support the Foxconn? Do you believe Foxconn will deliver on $10 billion investment and potentially 13,000 jobs? Because it would be, their manufacturing facility would be in the 1st District.
Yeah, as I walk around the southeast Wisconsin, and you're in Racine and Kenosha County, particularly the entire I-94 corridor from effectively the airport to the state line, there's real optimism. And so Foxconn is going in and things are beginning to change. People are in that area. I was at a business recently that's raising their wages preemptively, knowing that Foxconn is coming. So you talk to the workers that were in this factory that I toured the other day, and I was chatting with the workers. They're optimistic. They're seeing their wages starting to increase. And so I think there's a real optimism. And I think when I look as why are companies like Foxconn, there's a Herringbow, makes a candy that'll be opening up there soon with plans. Why are these companies coming to southeast Wisconsin? And it's, we have a workforce that'll compete with anybody anywhere in the world. And so I think there's an optimism. The workforce is ready to go. And what we need to do is continue to make economic changes in Washington that encourage these job hiring companies to come to places like Wisconsin so that we can compete with anybody anywhere in the world.
Last week, the President's Council on Economic Advisors issued a statement, and it said, quote, "The U.S. war on poverty is largely over and a success," close quote. And the issue here is whether Medicaid recipients and others receiving public benefits should be required to work. Do you agree with the premise that the war on poverty is over and it was a success?
So I'll tell you, I was in Kenosha just yesterday and went to the Shalom Center. The Shalom Center is a faith-based organization that addresses homelessness and also the hunger. Sat and had a good conversation with their executive director, met a number of the individuals who are staying at the shelter, and there's a real opportunity for faith-based local organizations to address poverty issues in their community. And so what we have seen at times is the federal government coming in and incentivizing individuals inappropriately. And so some of these faith-based organizations and private sector organizations, which are partially government funded in times, this particular institution is about 15% government funded, 85% locally funded. And in doing that, they're providing mechanisms to encourage individuals to work. There's a young man that I met there who was getting up at 5 p.m. because he was going to 6 p.m. to go to work at the new Amazon location on the I-94 corridor. Mm-hmm. And so there's opportunities where at a local level, they're far better equipped to take individuals who've fallen on hard times, to bring them back in, provide them the support structure that they need to get them back on their feet and back to work. And this young man was going to his third day of work at the Amazon distribution center. There's a real excitement in his eyes. But it wasn't because the federal government came in and solved his problem. This guy had some excitement in his eyes because, in particular, there was a whole faith-based community. There's members of the local church that were there that were feeding dinner. Would have been his breakfast because he was working the night shift. But that's where I met him. And you go and you talk to these individuals, and I look at that and say, who's better equipped to address some really significant needs in our community? And is it the local community itself? Is it our local churches, civic organizations, companies, or is it the federal government? And as I look, often the federal government fails some of the neediest amongst us. And that really is kind of the crux of what's going on. So as I look at it, you need to get the federal government's cookie-cutter approach out of the way. You need to empower our local communities, our local churches, our local civic organizations to find ways to creatively address some of these generational problems at times, but often it's just an individual who fell on hard times. And that young man or woman needs a support structure that might not fit into a very cookie-cutter approach from Washington. They might have fallen into an approach that needs to be addressed in Kenosha. And somebody in Kenosha knows where the job opportunity is that might fit this young man or woman. And so there's some real success stories there. And so I'd like to see a new approach as to how we address some of the neediest amongst us and really alter and change these people's lives in a positive way.
Two final questions. Do you have any major policy differences with Paul Ryan?
So as I look at it, I think there's a lot of opportunity for economic growth. And so in particular, I often look where there's problems with the final product. I think there's problems in the process. And so I think I can take a manufacturing, private sector background and address some of these process problems that have ultimately delivered products that aren't really in the benefit of the people and the voters of our state. And so that's really where I want to put my time, energy, and focus in.
Final question, crowded primary on August 14th. You want to highlight any differences with your primary opponents, and one of whom, Mr. Nalen, calls you the anointed Republican Party candidate. Do you want to respond to that or talk about other opponents on August 14th?
I think everybody brings a unique set of personal background and experience to the table. I think mine's unique in a positive way. I serve on the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents, focused for 2.5 years on workforce development and how do we train students for the jobs of the future. Spent the last 9 years working in manufacturing. How do you actually solve problems? How do you address problems head on? And you got to get results for your ultimate customer. I think that's the right type of background that we need. People that share Wisconsin values, born and raised in Janesville. And as I look to the unique background that I bring to the table, I think that aligns really closely as I'm out there talking with people of the 1st District. And I think ultimately that will allow me to earn their trust and confidence come first the primary and ultimately in November.
Thank you. Bryan Steil of Janesville is the Republican candidate in the 1st Congressional District. The primary is August 14th. Bryan, thanks for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.